Hello and welcome to the Vine Life Podcast. I'm Tony Clark, your host. Today I have the honor of having Joe Castillo on the program. And if you don't know any of Joe Castillo's work, he's an artist, he's a speaker, storyteller. He's got a passion for promoting the visual arts as a way of touching the heart. His artwork continues to sell worldwide. He's the author of several books and countless articles. Joe uses his sand as his medium to create fluid art that tells a story. He's performed in about 45 states, 27 foreign countries, and he's gotten the chance to perform for 4 living presidents and kings and queens and CEOs all over the world. Now, he also, I believe, was the runner-up in Season 7 of America's Got Talent. I certainly want to ask him all of these questions and about that as well. But, Joe, thank you for being on the program.
Thank you, Tony. What a privilege to be able to be here, and I sure appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Absolutely. Well, you're fascinating. Your work has fascinated myself and my wife, and I just, I'm blessed to be able to have you on the program. Thank you that you agreed. But Joe, you're a well-known artist, but I always like to start in the beginnings or the genesis of careers, I guess. What made you first interested in the arts?
Well, I sort of tell people when I'm introduced as an artist, but it's not my fault. My mother was an artist. My father was an artist. My Aunt Carolyn was an artist. I had an uncle named Artie. So go figure. I had to get into art. My mom swears that my first solid food was Crayola crayons. So I was knee-high to a grasshopper when I started drawing and painting and sculpting and doing all sorts of things to do with the arts.
Now, Joe, I looked at your bio, and you've got different categories of art that you have done in the past and you currently do. And I wanted to ask you about the distinctions between these. Now, one is word stories, the other is art story, and the other, certainly, lastly, and we'll get to that, is sand story. But can you briefly describe what is a word story and an art story to the audience?
Yeah, art story is really what I started with because when you're a kid, you use crayons and you use finger paints and pens and pencils. And so although I started as an artist in a family of artists, the other thing that was a part of that was that both my mom and dad were storytellers. And they loved to incorporate stories in almost everything that we did. And so my art got tethered to stories. So the first art that I did was stories, and I developed my own comic book series when I was, in middle school. And then as my drawings evolved, I wanted to include stories with them. So they started as art stories, but then I discovered that I had to write them down to be able to incorporate them. And so the art and the writing kind of merged. Art story is the drawings. Word story is the stories that I wrap into the drawings.
Now, my wife and I were in Christ in the Smokies, which was a wax museum in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. Mm-hmm. And we were there a number of years ago, and we came across some of your art. And I can't remember if it was a face of a book or this bookmark that I'm holding in front of me, but I happened to look at the face. I was thinking, well, that's just a face of Christ, someone that has illustrated. And my wife picked it up and she said, look at this. It's something much deeper than that. And within the face of Christ here, and we'll put up images in more detail on the recording here, but it's the story of Christ throughout the images. So I'm looking at the face of Christ here. You've got Christ, the feeding of the 5,000. You've got Christ praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. You've got the birth of Christ all the way up through the death, burial, and resurrection within the face of Christ. I'd never seen anything like that. Mm-hmm. And it just blows me away at the detail that you've been able to produce in this image. And from a distance, it looks like the face of Christ. But when you get closer, it's the entire history or the entire story, basically, of the gospel. And how did you come up with this idea? Did you see something similar, or did you just say, I'm going to make something more detailed within these faces that you do?
Well, the truth of the matter is that I got coerced into it by my pastor. Most people, at least most people my age and older, have seen something that were called chalk talks. And that was something that was in the early 1900s. Traveling evangelists would bring in an easel and these large pieces of chalk, and they would teach and tell a story. And while they were telling the story, they would draw something on their easel, and it usually was a picture of the Jordan River, or there was a shepherd and some lambs and that sort of story. And so it was really engaging because people were being captivated not only by the ear gate, but the eye gate as well. And I really loved those things. But one Christmas, my pastor asked me to do a chalk story, one of these stories illustrated in chalk. And I said, John, I don't have chalks. I don't have an easel. And furthermore, I'm a commercial artist. I just don't do Christian artwork. And he got in my face. He said, Joe, you're an artist, you're a Christian, do something. So I went home and I was sort of like Moses when God said, what do you have in your hand? And so what I had in my hand was I had magic markers and I had rolls of newsprint. So I thought, okay. So I got a sheet of 4 feet by 8 feet newsprint, and I got my magic markers, and I started telling a story. But the details then needed to combine into something. And so I worked for weeks and weeks to try and put this together. And it was sort of a God thing, that God was able to put all the images together, and people would get caught up in the details as I went around, because I was drawing this as high as I could reach. And then at the very end, I put the eyes and the nose in, and people realized that it was a face. And so that was how the first one got started, with the story of Christ compiled in all the details.
And not only the face of Christ, I've also seen some of your work. You've got the Virgin Mary. You've also got, I believe, C.S. Lewis as well. Is that correct?
That's true. Well, see, what happened was God then affirmed what I had done. And so people came up afterwards and says, wow, I really like that, and I would like a copy. So I did a pen and ink rendering, and I handed out. And then people said next year, what are you going to do now? So I wound up doing Moses and Paul and all the stories, the details that then compiled to make their face. And after you've done it for 6 or 7 years, then C.S. Lewis seemed like a likely one with his Narnia Chronicles, and that was a fun one to do as well.
So it's my understanding, Joe, that this type of artwork kind of transitioned to, I guess, what you're most known for, especially after America's Got Talent a number of years ago. Now, you're famous for creating a sand story, and you tell stories with sand, I believe, on a light box that's projected to the audience or behind the stage. Now, tell me a little bit how that. Let's start at the beginning here about the sand story. How did you start that? How did you come up with that concept to create art with sand?
Well, my first career was really advertising. And so in advertising, that's what you're doing, is you're telling stories. And a good story, well told in about 30 seconds or 60 seconds, is what an advertisement is. And you're trying to engage the audience in this story. And so you watch any commercial, and that's what they're trying to do, is tell a story. And so after almost 20 years of that, stories were ingrained. Well, my first wife passed away from breast cancer, and I just was reconfiguring my life, and I thought, what am I going to do now? So I sold my business, went back to school, and went to seminary. I graduated from seminary, and then I was asked to do a church plant. And so in those ensuing years, I had remarried, and my wife and I moved to Richmond, Kentucky, and we did a church plant. So it was a brand new church. We could configure it any way we wanted. And I wanted to include the visuals, because I knew that people would remember only 20% of what they hear, but 80% of what they hear and see. And so I started doing some of the line drawings that I'd done back in the day. I started doing spray paint. I did sculptures. And after about 4 or 5 years, I was running out of ideas. Easter was coming up. I wanted to tell the Easter story in a new, compelling way. And I'd seen somebody do a sand art piece with what they call stop motion photography. That's the way they do Gumby, Wallace and Gromit. It's called claymation, but he was doing it with sand. And I thought, maybe I can do something with that. So my wife had sent me to the hardware store, and she wanted me to get some mulch for the garden. When I got home, I had a sack full of sand and a kitchen light fixture, and I cobbled the whole thing together and started drawing in the sand. I duct taped a handy cam over the top of the table, and sure enough, the images started coming together. And so that Easter was my very first sand story.
Wow. So a trip to Lowe's, God used that, or the construction store that you went to, God used that to start a new career for you. That's pretty amazing. And watching you perform these sand stories, and my wife and I were watching a lot of your videos last night and lead up to this interview. But it's one of those things where you don't quite see what the picture is until you're almost finished. And then it's like a wow moment. And we were watching, I think, one of your sand stories where Christ was on the cross, and I wasn't getting it, but she was like, oh my gosh, it's Christ on the cross with his head bowed. And I was trying to picture it. I couldn't picture it, but then you did the arms and the chest, and it's like it came together for me. And it's like, this is a miraculous God-given talent that you've got. And you're not only able to tell the gospel story and stories about faith, but you've used this talent worldwide as well. And in fact, you were, I believe, the runner-up on America's Got Talent in, I think, season 7. And how did that come about? How did you get to be on America's Got Talent?
Well, you're right about two things. First of all, it definitely is a God thing, because in the final analysis, I'm just playing around with sand on a table. And so the images that God puts together there, and although I do rehearse them and they're very carefully choreographed to the music, they were surprisingly compelling. I mean, it was a surprise to me. And, I've been doing it for 16 years now, and I still, at times, I'll be on stage and the audience will go completely dead silent. And they'll be so captivated with the music and the images that I know this is a God moment. It really, I'm almost sort of unnecessary. God is the one that's doing it. But the second thing that you're right about is that because I can tell a story in the sand, and so one image can be morphed into another, and I discovered I could tell any kind of story. And so whereas I started with the Passion of the Christ, then pretty soon I started getting phone calls to have people, commercial businesses that wanted me to tell their stories. And so I thought, well, why not? By that time, the church had grown, and I'd stepped down as pastor, and I was considering what am I going to do next. My wife said, well, let's do some of those sand stories. And that was when some of my clips got on YouTube and the phone started ringing. And we literally started traveling the globe. I mean, we had calls from China and from Saudi Arabia and from Milan, Italy. And so we were traveling and performing, and my clips got on YouTube. And then America's Got Talent called, and they wanted me to come and be on the show. And the funny thing about it is that I turned them down for 2 years. Oh, wow. I said, look, I'm busy. I don't have time to go be on America's Got Talent. And the third year they called, my wife says, hon, just go try out. And sure enough, that's how we wound up on the show.
Wow, an amazing story, an amazing road that was, and it's I've did a little bit of research in your time at America's Got Talent, and you're quoted as saying that through some of that you had to be wise as a serpent but harmless as a dove, I believe, and you used wisdom to kind of navigate your way, because it's my understanding that they didn't want you to come out and really present a gospel message. You kind of had to get around that and plant seeds. Can you tell me about that experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I started out, I mean, the very first sand story that I did on America's Got Talent, I thought, this is going to go nowhere. The three judges in season 7 were Howie Mandel, Sharon Osbourne, and Howard Stern. And so the sand story I did was God Bless the USA to Lee Greenwood's song. And I thought, they're not going to want it. They don't want that on there. I'm going to get 3 X's and get sent home. Howie Mandel, he was Jewish. So why would he want God to bless the USA? Sharon Osbourne was British. She wouldn't want God to bless the USA. And Howard Stern, I didn't even know if he believed in God or not. So I thought, what the heck? So I went ahead and did it. All 3 of them gave me a standing ovation and then passed me on. But then I wanted to tell the Bible stories that I had developed in church. And that's when I started getting some pushback. The people on the show didn't want those kinds of stories. And at first I got a little frustrated. But the reality is that it's their show. I'm on there by their good pleasure. And even though they don't pay you while you're on the show, I mean, they cover your hotel bill and $35 a day as your food supplement. So you could starve to death, on $35 a day, especially in Las Vegas or New Jersey. But that was when I started having to think through the stories that I could tell and tell them in a way that would be engaging and still get the message across.
Now, I think one of those stories you were asked, I think, to portray, maybe in the rehearsals you did Jesus, and you were asked by maybe a producer to do Jesus without a beard. Is that correct? Can you tell me that story?
That's right. I sort of joke around. I say, on America's Got Talent, America votes, but the producers decide. And so they were the ones that either approved or didn't approve the music and the images and whatnot. And so I thought I'd be real smart. And I discovered a song that went way back to the 70s. And it was by a group called the Youngbloods. And it's become one of those iconic songs. Come on, people, smile on your brother. Everybody get together and love one another right now.
Oh, yeah.
So I suggested that, and they approved it. What they didn't know is it is a Christian song. You listen to the lyrics, and you're going to find out that they're singing about, and the one that left us here returns for us at last. But I cut out a snippet. I thought, okay, I'm going to tell the story of the prodigal son. And the final image was supposed to be Jesus holding a young man, embracing a young man. And they were all challenging because they only give you 90 seconds to tell a story. But that last image was going to be Jesus embracing the young man, kind of like the father welcoming the son home. And the producer comes up to me during rehearsals and he says, Joe, well, that's going to work, but you're going to have to get rid of the beard on the guy. It's just not a good look. And so I thought, well, okay. And so during rehearsals, I drew Jesus without a beard, except it didn't look like Jesus. But then I got on stage on live television and I thought, what are they going to do? Shoot me? So I went ahead and I drew Jesus. If you were watching real close, you even notice that I dropped the wound into the back of his hand. And as soon as I was done, Howard Stern jumps to his feet and he says, Joe, who was that supposed to be? And before I even got a chance to answer, Howie Mandel on the end says, or Sharon Osbourne says, she turns to Howard and says, Howard, that was Jesus. He says, oh, that wasn't Jesus. And then Howie Mandel pipes up and he says, Howard, you're Jewish. You wouldn't recognize Jesus if you saw him. So I didn't have to say a thing, and everybody in the audience knew it was Jesus, and the whole world. I mean, there was 13.5 million viewers that particular episode, and they all knew it was Jesus. And so it wound up being just fantastic. And I had all the Christians voting for me, and it was really a great moment in the show.
Now, yeah, great story. And it's my understanding in the final, you had something prepared that you weren't allowed to use. Is that correct? And you had to do something else that wasn't quite as spectacular.
That's right. The final competition night was actually on September 12th, on the 10th anniversary of 9/11. And we were performing right across the river from where the Twin Towers had gone down. And so I prepared a piece. I even had a good friend of mine compose the music so that they couldn't turn down the music. So I had the rights to the music. And I did a sand story piece about 9/11. And it was a calm day, New York City skyline. And then you hear the planes coming in, and then the explosions, and the two towers come down, and the sirens, and you see the first responders, the firefighters, and the policemen, and just the chaos. And then in the end, the music switches, and I wound up with the I-beam cross that they discovered at Ground Zero. Wow. As the firefighters were raising the American flag. And it was a beautiful piece, and they wouldn't let me do it. They said, no, it's too controversial, whatnot. So I said, okay. God got me there to begin with. I wound up right where I needed to be, and I certainly had the exposure that I never could have gotten any other way. And so I did cartoons of the three judges and wound up as a runner-up instead of the winner. And I was fine with that.
Yeah. Wow. Well, yeah, God got you there, and it sounded like it was his plan for you to be as a runner-up there. But, while you were saying that, Joe, while you were talking about that experience, you've been able to use your talent and your gifts in areas where maybe a Christian pastor would not be allowed to go. And because you were once a pastor, and I think you certainly understand this better than I do, but you're able to plant seeds and plant seeds of the gospel, plant seeds of truth in venues that you wouldn't be allowed to give a sermon. What advice would you have? I know because most of us as Christians, we're not involved in full-time vocational ministry, but we're blue-collar workers, we're white-collar workers. We're artists, we're musicians. How would you, just your advice to someone out there, how could we plant seeds where maybe we're not allowed to give the full gospel message, but how can we plant seeds like you did at America's Got Talent? Do you have any advice for young musicians or just someone working in the field?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And the first thing is be a storyteller. You see, that's what God did. When he gave us the scriptures, it's a story. It's his story. It's history. And so you read the scriptures, and what you're reading is God's narrative. And each one of those stories are things that we can relate to today. I was just last week, I was talking to a father whose grown son has just gone off the rails, and he is just grieving over his son. And I said, Brian, go read the story of King David as he wept for his son Absalom. And yours is not, it's not something new. It happens all down through history. And in all of that, God encouraged David's heart, and God can encourage your heart. And so telling stories is critical. Think of the stories that have impacted us down through the years. They weren't Bible stories. Stories like Pilgrim's Progress, or C.S. Lewis and the Narnia Chronicles, or Hannah Smith and Hind's Feet on High Places. These are allegories, and it's the stories that capture our hearts. And Lewis doesn't mention Jesus anywhere in the Narnia Chronicles. But I talked to a young girl from Japan, and she said she had become a Christian. And I said, how did you become a Christian in Japan? She said, well, my parents were Buddhists, but they gave me a copy of the Narnia Chronicles. And
Oh,
about the
wow.
third book in, she said, I realized that Aslan was Jesus.
Oh my
So
gosh.
those stories are critical. And the second thing is use the arts. Christians, we lost the arts, particularly with television and movies and now video games. We ought to be out there on the forefront of using the arts to communicate these stories. And the what I do, which is just, I mean, Tony, this is so much fun. I get invited to a place like IIT in Kanpur, India. IIT is the largest tech school in India. It's 10 times bigger than MIT and 30 times harder to get into. And so here we are performing for 8,000 Indian students, the brightest and the best. And they tell me, well, do what you want to do. And so I put together a piece about India. And then I said, now I'm going to close with my favorite sand story. This is the first sand story I ever created. And I close with the Passion of the Christ. And those students, about 80% Hindu, about 15% Muslim, and a smattering of Christians, and they give me a standing ovation. And they come up, many of them with tears in their eyes, saying, wow, I needed to hear that story. And so I've gotten a chance to perform that literally all over the place where they never would invite me in as a pastor or a missionary or a Christian speaker. But as an artist, I get to go in and tell that story.
Wow. Truly amazing. And it just, Joe, it just seems like a lot of Christian art and music is kind of focused toward Christians instead of being focused toward, just folks out there that don't know the Lord. And I think we can, I think we can do better as artists, as musicians, because you're a well-known artist, but you don't come across as, I've got I'm a Christian artist. No, you're an artist,
Right.
but you've got faith, and you can plant seeds and of the gospel. You can plant seeds of truth like that. You mentioned the C.S. Lewis series of Chronicles, and I know of other artists that are doing that as well. But that's an amazing gift that you've got, and I just wish that we, as the body of Christ, would take that lead and be the best at whatever field we're in. Just be the best at that. And then I think that opens up opportunities for the gospel. If we're really good at what we do, other people will admire that. Their hearts will be open, I believe. And then we could share deeper truth. So it sounds like you're doing that. And I'm so appreciative of the way that you're doing that. And I'm learning from that. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. And it really, it's a door that God opened, and I went through it, my wife and I, and she was, one of the little backstories that hardly anybody hears is early on, she discovered that she doesn't want to go into the auditorium where I'm performing. And so she
Really?
goes and finds a quiet room somewhere and she prays. And I'm convinced that at least 97% of any success I've had have been because of her prayers. And so that's a very powerful thing to include in anything that you do.
Wow, that's pretty sound advice. And thank you for that. Now, let's move on, if you don't mind, from the sand story. And again, we'll have images up of some of your work during this interview on the screen. But let's move on to, you're also an author, and you've authored several books. And one of the latest book that you've got out, I believe the title is called Love Letters. And there's a lot of, I read the description of this book. I want to buy the book and read it. But tell me about Love Letters. What made you write this book?
Well, as I told you earlier, when I was starting to do the art stories, the drawings, I had to write the story down before the artwork so I would know what kind of story I was telling. If I was going to tell the story of the Apostle Paul, I had to figure out where he went on his missionary journeys and what happened to him. And here he gets stoned in Lystra and he goes to Mars Hill. And so I would write the story. the stories little by little begin to be books. And when the sand story hit, and my wife and I all of a sudden discovered us, that we were traveling all over the place. I had all this time on airplanes, and I would come back and tell people these stories about having to perform for King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, and worried that I was going to get my head chopped off because the final image was supposed to be him. And I'm thinking, gee, if I do a terrible job of this, they're going to find a YouTube video with me getting my head chopped off. And I would tell people these stories, and they would say, you got to write them down. And so I started writing these stories down. Well, then 2020 came along, and boom. I mean, we had 24 signed contracts of events that we were going to perform, and every one of them shut down.
Goodness.
And so I'm sitting around the house, and I'm doing little projects, and I'm fidgeting because I'm a creative, and I'm hauling out paintbrushes, and I'm trying to paint stuff. And my wife, who I will say again is the brighter one of the two, she said, Joe, there's this writers conference, this workshop out in San Diego. I think you should go out there. So I said, okay, who's teaching this thing? She said, well, it's a guy named Bob Goff. And I said, Bob Goff, I've never heard of the guy. She said, no worries, Amazon will deliver his book tomorrow. So I get his book. Well, before I even get out of bed the next day, she has me registered for this workshop, and I go off. And the backstory is that way back 22 years previously, when I was in seminary, I discovered that God's word was storytelling. And I was taking Hebrew class and all this convoluted, Hebrew is a tough language. And we had to translate a portion of the Old Testament into English. And so I was looking around, and being kind of a classic overachiever, I picked Psalm 119, which is the longest chapter in the whole Bible. So I dive into this thing and discover it's an incredible story. First of all, it's a collection of verses, 176 verses that are divided into 22 segments, and each segment of 8 verses is an acrostic. And that means that the first letter of each one of those 8 verses starts with the same letter. So the first 8 verses of Psalm 119 start with Aleph, which is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Second 8 verses starts with Bet, second letter, all the way through 22, every single letter in the Hebrew alphabet. I was fascinated by that. I could just imagine some little Hebrew scribe working away, and he hollers out to Hannah in the kitchen, and he says, Hannah, I need another word that starts with Gimel. Help me out here. I'm using them all up. And then the second thing about Psalm 119 is here are 176 verses, and every single verse mentions the Word of God, His testimonies, His guidelines, His instructions, His wisdom. And a lot of these verses we're familiar with. Your word is a light unto my feet and a lamp unto my path. Your instructions have made me wiser than my teachers. Your guidelines have encouraged me when I was discouraged. And so as I was translating, I was thinking, I've got 2 daughters that could so benefit from reading this. How could I get my 2 daughters to read the longest chapter in the Bible? And I came up with this crazy idea of writing a novel that somehow incorporated all of Psalm 119. And so I started writing some things, and then life intervened, and I set it aside, and every now and then I'd be reminded of it. 22 years went by, and it was sitting in a folder in my filing cabinet. And I go to this writers' conference, and Bob Goff says, Joe, well, what are you writing on? I said, well, I've been working on this book. He said, well, why haven't you finished it? And I said, well, I don't think anybody will publish it. I don't think anybody will read it. I wanted to write it for my daughters, but my daughters have grown up and now have daughters of their own. So he said, how long you been writing this book? And I said, well, it's been 22 years. He said, Joe, finish the darn book. I said, okay. So I came back from the writers' conference. 30 days later, I finished the book.
Goodness.
Then went through, of course, the editing process and all of that. And just in May 15th of this year, I got it done, got it up on Amazon. And one of the convictions that went through the process, see, the biggest challenge, Tony, was the fact that I was writing this book for young women, first my daughters and then my granddaughters, and I was neither. So this is a giant leap for me. But with some real help, Kim Stewart, who's a wonderful writer, coached me through it. And she kept saying over and over again, Joe, this is supposed to be a love story, not an educational treatise. You got to make it a love story. And so I had to rewrite. But it turned out better than I anticipated. And I came to the conclusion that any proceeds that come from the sale of this book are going to this wonderful ministry here in Atlanta called Wellspring Living that helps rescue young women from sex trafficking.
Wow. And I want you to tell me much more about Wellspring Living, but in just a minute. But you also talked about, I believe in the description of helping with biblical literacy. And can you speak to that in just a moment? And a lot of believers, a lot of followers of Christ, a lot of the church is biblically illiterate, if I can even pronounce that. But why, how would a book like this help encourage people to get into the scriptures? You mentioned Psalm 119. That's got all of these helps, all of these encouragements for every area of our life, but we're mostly biblically illiterate. And why do you think that is, and how can we solve that, Joe?
Well, you're absolutely right. And I had this wonderful blessing of the fact that both my mom and dad were readers. That kind of ties into the whole idea of storytelling. And we had a wonderful library when I was growing up, and I read just copiously all the time. I still do. I still put away, a book or two every couple of weeks. And there's a lot of books out there that aren't worth reading. But one of the things, if you read any at all, you begin to discover that the English language, and probably many of the languages on the face of the planet, were undergirded by the scriptures.
Wow.
One of the early codifiers of the English language was William Shakespeare, and he quoted the Bible all the time. The early writers, the British writers, even today, there are so many quotations that have become part of our language that come from the scriptures. And people have forgotten that. They've forgotten that the truths that undergirded our entire culture here in the United States was the Bible. The very first textbook in our public schools was something called the McGuffey Reader. And it had a Bible verse for every single letter of the alphabet. So as kids learned the alphabet in kindergarten and first grade, they were learning the Bible. Nowadays, people are not reading the Bible. And yet that is the fountainhead of truth. So as I was writing this book, Love Letters, of course, love letters is the scriptures. This is what God wrote. It's a love letter for us. And if we don't see that, we just haven't read it enough. And so as we read the scriptures, we not only develop a foundation for how to live, but we develop a language to be able to communicate with others. How many phrases like a wolf in sheep's clothing? I mean, that came from the Bible. Drink water from your own well. That came from the scriptures. Children, honor your parents. That's from the scriptures. Don't kill. That's from the scriptures. Don't commit adultery. That's the scriptures. On and on and on. So I got a little carried away there, but I think you got the gist of it.
Yeah. And I was thinking of others. One came to mind, Doubting Thomas. Don't be a Doubting Thomas.
Doubting Thomas.
It goes on and on and on.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you brought that up. Yeah. So much of our English language is based upon, or maybe idioms or sayings that we have are based upon biblical truths and scripture. And we forget about that. And I was scrolling through your website, looking at some of your art. You've got, kind of relates to me to that. It may not have been your intent, but you've got a picture or one of your images of the Statue of Liberty with a tear. And I think I get that. I think that we've kind of, as a society, we've gone away from those truths, and I can see the sadness there. So that really relates to me in that image. But the proceeds for this book are going to, you mentioned Wellspring Living. And tell me more about that, and we'll provide the links at the bottom of the videos as well on how to support not only your work, Joe, but also Wellspring Living. Tell me about Wellspring Living.
Well, I really appreciate you doing that. And it's easy to remember, wellspringliving.org. But here's a kind of an interesting irony, is that 22 years ago, when I was just conceiving the original thoughts for this book, there was a young woman named Mary Frances Ware, and she found out that prostitutes were being taken advantage of and abused in downtown Atlanta. And a lot of times they were getting beaten up and sometimes arrested and thrown in jail. And often they were the innocent ones. And so she started a ministry called Wellspring Living 22 years ago. And the ministry grew, and God blessed it, and they got campuses, and they got places where these women could come and be restored and get an education, get health care, get training for a vocation. And then about 4 years ago, she got a phone call from Kasim Reed, who was the mayor of Atlanta. And he knew her, and he had encouraged and supported this ministry. And he said, Mary Frances, we've got some problems here that we just don't know what to do with. And she said, what is it? And he said, we are starting to pick up young women on the streets of Atlanta that are being trafficked, that are 13 and 14 and 15 years old. And he said, we don't have any place to put them. It's either juvenile or put them in jail. And he said, it breaks my heart. And so Mary Frances said, no, you're right. We got to do something about it. And so she went to her supporters and started raising money. And they now have 2 homes where they bring these young girls in. And the stories are heartbreaking. Often they were trafficked by their own family members, by a stepfather or by their mother. And at this incredibly young age. And then they get sold to pimps who mistreat them and abuse them. And their self-image is destroyed. They have no education. They have no life skills. And so Mary started taking these girls in. And we began hearing about this ministry. And so I went down there and did a sand story piece for them. And we had 32 girls in the room. And I got a chance to touch their hearts a little bit, to tell them the story of the prodigal son, except I told it as the prodigal daughter. Wow. And how I'm sorry, I get a little emotional here, but how Jesus is always on the road looking for us to return to him. And so I went to Mary Frances and I started talking to her and I said, how can we help? And she said, well, right now, somebody has donated a piece of property, but we're going to need $15 million to build a campus to be able to house these girls and to have a school and to have a health clinic and to have training facilities where they can learn a career. And so she's embarked on this huge effort. And I said, count me in, lady. We're going to do what we can. They have a fundraiser here in South Atlanta in Fayetteville called Summer Supper. You can find that on their website. And it's a fundraiser, and I'm going to perform a sand story there and help promote the book and do what we can to raise the funds to help these young women.
Wow, that's quite an impressive organization that the proceeds of this book go to, and how you're involved as well, and more people need to hear about that ministry. And I'll provide all of the links, for the podcast, for the video podcast, below the description as well. And I encourage you guys and gals, if you're watching this or listening to this, and your heart is something's tugging at your heart to give, don't delay. Go ahead and give to this ministry, Wellspring Living. Click on the link, and you can find the donation button to give. And so a cause worthy of your support. Joe, what are your plans for the future? What's on your agenda?
Well, let me say one more thing about the book, because I have
Please.
a copy of it right here. And I had the great privilege of designing the cover and writing the flyleaf, and telling about the ministry and the acknowledgments. But here is one of the cool things about the book. Tony, it's a love letter, and it's a love story. And so young girls are going to read this, and they're going to read about a young woman that went off on a journey and experienced all the things that they experience. I mean, depression and discouragement and rejection and abuse and the struggles that she went through. And the book is a rousing, heroic story about a young girl who finds a purpose in life. She finds out that somebody truly loves her. She finds out that she's stronger than she thought she could be. And in the end, she winds up just heroically victorious. So this is a book for guys too. It's not just for young women. It's for anybody that needs some hope and some encouragement. And of course, woven through the whole thing is Psalm 119. Yeah. So the future. Wow. Well, I turned, and to some people this sounds ancient. It sounds like Methuselah. I turned 74 this year. And I am more encouraged and more excited about my life and the future maybe than I ever have. Because I think one of the things that God tells us in his story is that if we're generous with what we have, he expands our vision. He expands our ministry. It's like seeds that we have in our hands. And if we cling to those seeds, then nothing happens. But if we scatter the seeds, and if the soil is good, then the seeds germinate and they grow and they blossom. And guess what? The harvest is sometimes 30-fold or 60-fold or 100-fold. And by the way, that's not 100%. 100-fold is 1,000% of what you planted. So I'm going to keep writing. I've got a second book that's coming up for young men that I'm 14 chapters in. I'm still going to be telling the sand stories, and anybody that will have me come, I'll perform. And I want to tell the good stories. And then we have moved into this town that's right across the street from a new movie studios. It's called Trilith Studios, Trilith. Trilith Studios has now become the largest movie studio in the United States.
Gosh.
And I want to get my fingers into that pie so that we can make some better movies and use that as a venue and a vehicle for telling good stories.
Wow. Well, sounds like you've got an exciting future that that God is opening doors for you, Joe. And the folks I've had the pleasure of interviewing, musicians and artists, and those that are using what they have for the Lord, they just get more and more excited the up in years that they get. The older they get, the more young that they seem. And whatever you do, work at as unto the Lord and not to men. And certainly you're living testimony that God is making you more excited about what you're doing and the possibilities on the horizon. Yeah.
That's absolutely.
So, Joe, what I'll do below the video, I'll put the links to your website and all of these links. If folks want to order your materials or want to have you for a organization event, or Fortune 500 company wants to call you, or a church wants to call you, I'll provide all of those links. Anything else you want to add, Joe?
Just tremendous gratitude for what you're doing. God opens these little windows, and we don't always know what's going to happen with the little light, the little candle that we put on the edge of the window. But light wins out over darkness every time. And that light can impact somebody a long, long, long way away. I remember an illustration of a guy that went canoeing out in the North Woods, and he was on this giant lake, and he lit a candle and then got in his canoe and started paddling. And he got 1.5 miles away, and it was pitch dark night. He didn't know how he was going to get home, but he could see that candle. And so everything that we do, it doesn't matter if it's not some giant torch or stuff. We just do what we can with what we got. And if it's a pile of sand or a podcast, God is able to use that for his glory.
Very sound, very godly advice, and thank you for that. And Joe, I'm going to get you to hang on a few minutes after the close of the program, but Joe Castillo, and I'm going to provide all of his links below the video. I encourage you to check him out. You can go on YouTube and just type his name into the search box, and it will come up with his amazing work. You've got to see this guy performing this stuff live on stage. There's nothing like it. I can testify to that. But Joe, thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you, Tony, and God bless you for what you're doing. Keep it up.
And until next time.